They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a fortress so secure that not even a whisper escapes its walls. Inside these concrete corridors live some of the most dangerous men on Earth. Terrorists, killers, drug lords, locked away in silence for 23 hours a day. But this story isn't about the prisoners. It's about the architects, the shadowy designers who built the most secure prison in America, and maybe the most psychologically destructive one on Earth. Who were they? What drove them to create a place meant not just to contain, but to break? And how did they engineer silence so perfect it could drive a man insane? Before we dive in, do me one thing. If you love deep, cinematic stories that expose the dark truths behind the world's most secret prisons, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves real crime investigations. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because what you're about to see has been hidden from the public for over 30 years. Welcome to ADX Florence, the prison built for ghosts. The idea behind the monster. Who designed ADX Florence? You need to step back to a time when America's prisons were on fire, literally. The early 1990s were chaos. Riots, stabbings, guards killed inside maximum security, prisons that suddenly weren't so secure. The Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, gang lords and terrorists all behind bars, yet still orchestrating violence. Washington wanted control, absolute, unquestionable control. So the Federal Bureau of Prisons approved a project unlike anything before. A facility that would be the end of the line, the last stop for the worst of the worst. They called it the Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence. Inside the Bureau, though it had another name, the Control Unit. The mind behind the walls. Most people think a prison like ADX Florence was designed by government engineers. Faceless bureaucrats sketching blueprints behind locked doors. But that's not how it happened. The truth is, ADX Florence was born out of collaboration between two very different worlds, architecture and psychology. And when those two forces merged, they didn't just build a structure, they built a system. The lead architectural firm was Leo A. Daley, a prestigious company based in Omaha, Nebraska. They'd built embassies, courthouses, even military facilities. But this time, the U.S. government wanted something more radical, something never attempted on American soil. The Bureau of Prisons gave the firm one instruction: design a place no one can escape, no one can communicate, no one can rebel. Everything else was left to their imagination. One former architect, speaking anonymously years later, described the early design phase. We weren't just drawing cells. We were engineering human behavior. That's because this wasn't just a construction project. It was a psychological experiment, dressed as architecture. To achieve that, the Bureau of Prisons quietly consulted behavioral scientists, social psychologists, and security analysts. Their mission: to find the perfect environment where the human spirit could be controlled down to the second. They started with what was already known, Marion Prison in Illinois, the first true control unit in America. After a riot in 1983 left 2 guards dead, Marion went into permanent lockdown. Every inmate, 23 hours a day, isolated. No contact, no yard, no programs. It was brutal but effective, and Washington took notice. ADX Florence would take the Marion model and elevate it to something else entirely. No longer just punishment, but isolation perfected. Every hallway, every window, every inch of ADX was engineered with purpose. The architecture dictated behavioral submission. The hallways were narrow, so 2 inmates could never pass. The windows were angled upward, so prisoners could see nothing but sky. The doors opened only by remote control, ensuring no staff ever had to stand face-to-face with an inmate. Even the lighting was calculated, bright enough for surveillance cameras to see everything, but soft enough to blur time itself. The architects built the structure, but it was the psychologists who built the idea. Behind the walls of ADX Florence lies a philosophy, one borrowed from decades of behavioral control experiments. Isolation, deprivation, monotony. Together, these form what experts later called the architecture of psychological erosion. In simple terms, ADX Florence was designed to make inmates compliant by slowly breaking their sense of time, space, and self. Robert Hood. This place isn't designed for humanity. It's designed for control. And he was right. Because even at the design stage, engineers were told to think like behavioral engineers, not builders. Walls weren't barriers. They were instruments. Doors weren't access points. They were control triggers. Even the air vents were positioned to drown out sound. Inmates would breathe the same recycled air, hear the same mechanical hum, and stare at the same concrete for years on end, until their minds began to melt into the rhythm of the building itself. But who actually signed off on this? Who decided that America needed a place like this, a prison that functions less like a correctional facility and more like a human laboratory? That answer takes us straight into Washington, to the heart of the Federal Bureau of Prisons Secret Planning Committee in 1989. And what they discussed behind closed doors would shape U.S. incarceration for decades. In early 1990, a classified memorandum circulated among top officials within the Bureau. Its title was chillingly simple: Proposal for the Construction of Federal Administrative Maximum Facility. Within it were words that still haunt human rights lawyers today. It stated, the facility will operate under the principle of environmental control to ensure inmate behavior remains manageable at all times. Environmental control, a sterile phrase, but behind it was an idea pulled straight from psychological warfare playbooks. If you control the environment completely, you control the human being. And so, under federal funding, with the blessing of Congress, the blueprints for ADX Florence were born. Concrete became command. Silence became punishment. And architecture became weaponized. By the time the facility opened in 1994, its designers had created something America had never seen before. A place where no inmate could touch another human being, no guard needed to enter a cell, and no sound could travel farther than a few feet. ADX wasn't just a prison. It was a philosophy made real. And behind it were people who believed they were creating safety, but ended up building something closer to a psychological abyss. Because what happens when you place a human being in total silence for years? What happens when architecture itself becomes a warden? We're about to find out. The Psychologist's Blueprint. You might think prisons are built by engineers, but ADX Florence was built by psychology. To understand its design, you have to understand one concept, something the Bureau of Prisons called controlled environmental stimulus. It sounds technical, but means something terrifyingly simple. If you control everything a person sees, hears, and feels, you control them. In the decades before ADX was built, the U.S. government had quietly funded dozens of studies on the effects of isolation, some of them through prisons, some through military programs, some through experiments the public was never supposed to know about. Their conclusions were always the same. Take away human contact long enough, and even the strongest mind begins to break. And so, when architects at Leo A. Daley began drawing the first sketches of ADX, they didn't just consult security manuals. They looked to psychological research. One of the key figures whose work was examined was Dr. Craig Haney, a social psychologist who had spent decades studying the long-term effects of solitary confinement. Ironically, Haney's research was meant to warn against it, but within the Bureau, his studies became something else, a blueprint for total control. The logic went like this. If isolation causes compliance, then total isolation equals total obedience. But it's never that simple. Inside ADX Florence, inmates live in cells 7 feet by 12, sealed behind solid steel doors with narrow food slots. Their world is made of cold concrete, bed, desk, sink, and toilet molded from a single piece. They are watched by cameras 24/7. Their lights never fully go out. Even the air they breathe moves on schedule. And when they're allowed their 1 hour of recreation, it's in a concrete pit covered by wire mesh, open only to the sky. You can see sunlight, but never touch it. The psychologists behind the ADX design call this environmental conditioning. Inmates are stripped of every sensory experience that could give them control. Sightlines, sound, touch, human contact, even unpredictability. When every part of your life becomes identical, Your brain stops fighting. They call that behavioral stabilization. But prisoners called it torture. Inmates display symptoms of depression, anxiety, hallucination, and paranoia after extended periods of isolation. That line didn't come from a journalist. It came from the Bureau's own psychological evaluations, conducted in the early 2000s, almost a decade after ADX opened. By then, it was too late. The design had done its job. It had proven that you could control human behavior with architecture alone. Some experts began calling ADX Florence a living laboratory, a place where isolation wasn't a punishment. It was policy. For the Bureau, it was a success. No riots, no escapes, no major incidents. But for the people inside, it was a slow erasure of everything that made them human. The psychological foundation of ADX wasn't about violence. It was about predictability. When every movement is timed, every interaction controlled, every sound monitored, the human mind becomes submissive. That was the goal. Not chaos, not punishment, obedience. Years later, a former consultant who reviewed the design admitted, "We knew what prolonged isolation did to the brain. We built it anyway." Why? Because in their eyes, ADX wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. A clean, clinical kind of order, one that traded humanity for safety. But something unexpected happened. After just a few years of operation, the very psychological structure that made ADX work began to backfire. Guards reported inmates screaming through the vents. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others smeared their walls with messages, not to escape, but just to be heard. It turns out, when you push the human mind to silence, sometimes it screams louder. And that's when Washington started asking questions. Had ADX gone too far? Was this the future of American justice? Or a mistake they couldn't undo? Because by the early 2000s, the world began to notice. Human rights lawyers, journalists, and even psychologists who once supported the supermax idea were turning against it. They called ADX a human rights catastrophe and accused its creators of building a facility designed to break minds for efficiency. The Bureau denied it all, but one internal memo leaked years later revealed the truth. Extended isolation at ADX has demonstrated measurable psychological deterioration in long-term inmates. That's bureaucratic language for something much darker. The design worked too well. And here's the twist most people don't know. Those same architectural and psychological blueprints didn't stay locked in Colorado. They spread. ADX Florence became the template for supermax prisons across America. From California's Pelican Bay to Illinois' Tams Correctional Center. Each one modeled after the same eerie precision, the same sterilized isolation, the same philosophy of environmental control. The architects of ADX had created a monster, and it was multiplying. But the story doesn't end there, because buried deep in classified records lies the truth about what ADX was really built for, and who inside the government pushed it forward, even after the warnings. Coming up, the secret funding and the real mission of ADX Florence. The design of isolation. Every inch of ADX Florence is a statement of control. It's not just a prison. It's psychological architecture, a place designed to erase noise, sight, and touch. From the moment you step through its double gates, the air changes, the light changes, and so does time. No inmate ever walks more than a few feet without being seen, scanned, and recorded. But here's the dark brilliance. They never see you back. The architects called it control movement. To the men inside, it feels more like being buried alive. Each cell is an 86-square-foot concrete box, solid walls on 3 sides, a remote-controlled steel door on the 4th. No bars. No air vents big enough for a voice to travel through. Even the tiny window is slanted upward, so the only thing you can see is the sky. Not a guard, not another inmate, not even the mountains that surround you. This was no accident. It was geometry with a purpose, isolation engineered into form. Former Warden Robert Hood would later say, "It's not designed for humanity. It's designed for security." But when the blueprints first circulated among the Bureau of Prisons, one line in the margin caught everyone's attention: behavioral management through environmental control. That phrase, 6 words, changed everything. It meant the walls weren't just meant to contain bodies. They were meant to reshape minds. The design was based on studies from military psychologists, including methods once used in Cold War interrogation programs: silence, isolation, light deprivation. These weren't just deterrents. They were tools to break resistance. The architects and behavioral consultants believed that total isolation would lead to total submission, that a man with no sound, no sight, and no sense of control would eventually stop fighting back. And in the years that followed, ADX would prove that theory right at a horrifying cost. They didn't just build a prison. They built a mind machine. Every cell has what they call a compliance feature, a pressure-locked food slot that can shut instantly if an inmate acts up, a remote flush toilet that the guard can disable from the control room, even the lights, controlled externally, to deny inmates any control over their day or night. For the architects, it was innovation. For the prisoners, it was erasure. There's a reason many ex-wardens privately call ADX a clean version of hell, because the brilliance of its design is the same thing that makes it unbearable. But the question remains, who really drew the lines? Who turned theory into concrete and steel? The Bureau never released the names of the lead engineers. Publicly, it was credited to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in partnership with Ewing Cole, a Philadelphia-based design firm. But buried in internal documents, and later uncovered by investigative journalists, there were signatures that didn't match. Private contractors for military psychological operations, advisors from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, even consultants linked to the CIA's interrogation research. The fingerprints of secrecy were everywhere. One memo from 1991 described the project as a facility to test long-term containment strategies for high-threat subjects. That wasn't prison language. That was research language. So maybe ADX wasn't just built for safety. Maybe it was built for study. By the time the prison opened in 1994, it was hailed as escape-proof. But behind the headlines, there was something darker, a secret no one wanted to admit. ADX wasn't just about who they were locking in. It was about what kind of country we were becoming on the outside. The first inmates in the silent experiment. By 1994, ADX Florence was ready. Its walls stood solid in the Colorado desert. Its doors were steel, its corridors silent. And inside, the first inmates began to arrive. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, too violent for any other prison. Men who had terrorized cities. Men who had killed guards, plotted mass murder, or orchestrated terrorist attacks. And now, they were entering the ultimate isolation chamber. The first wave included names that would become infamous. Thomas Silverstein, a convicted murderer whose time in previous prisons had left him with a trail of dead guards. Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, a man who had eluded the FBI for almost 2 decades. For the Bureau, these men were high-value behavioral subjects, and ADX was the experiment. Each inmate was assigned a cell 7 by 12 feet of concrete and steel. Their meals delivered through a slot. Lights timed for 23 hours of isolation. No contact, no conversation, no privacy, except what the walls allowed. Psychologists had predicted certain outcomes. Silverstein would become violent if provoked. Youssef would attempt manipulation through written messages. Kaczynski would retreat into obsessive routines. But the reality inside ADX was something else entirely. Within weeks, the first effects began to show. Silverstein, already notorious for his violent streak, adapted in a terrifying way. Without other humans to dominate or attack, he turned his aggression inward, writing cryptic messages on his cell walls, obsessively planning revenge he could no longer act on. Youssef, trained to manipulate, found the isolation maddening. Letters to lawyers were heavily monitored. Every attempt at communication blocked. And the genius of his planning, the networks he had built outside, began to unravel. Kaczynski, the meticulous loner, thrived in routine. But even he could not escape the crushing weight of time itself slowing down. Days became weeks, weeks became months. The monotony of light, air, and silence began to erode him, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It was at this point the architects' and psychologists' predictions were proven. ADX Florence had become a living laboratory. Silence, enforced by concrete, steel, and policy, worked. Isolation, reinforced by procedure, doors, and corridors, worked. Time, manipulated by light and movement schedules, worked. And yet, the human mind resisted in unpredictable ways. Some inmates began to hallucinate. Some spoke to themselves for hours on end. Some refused to eat, while others wrote endless notes to a world they could no longer touch. In a 7 by 12-foot cell, surrounded by unfeeling concrete, the first prisoners of ADX discovered a truth the architects had predicted but couldn't fully control. The body can be contained, but the mind fights back. One warden wrote, "Silverstein spends hours staring at the ceiling. Occasionally he speaks to the walls. Sometimes we hear him laughing to himself. He is alive, but this is not life as we know it." The Bureau noted this clinically. The psychologists called it expected behavioral adaptation. The inmates called it hell. This was the reality of ADX Florence, a prison designed not just for containment, but for behavioral compliance. The first inmates had become the proof of concept that extreme isolation could control the most violent individuals, that environmental manipulation could override human instinct, that a building, paired with psychology, could reshape the mind itself. But even in success, cracks began to show. Some prisoners refused to adapt. Some guards reported fear of what men like Silverstein could become if ever released. And critics outside the Bureau began to question, how far is too far? Because ADX wasn't just a prison. It was a silent experiment on human endurance. And the world was watching, slowly, realizing its implications. ADX Florence expands. Replication and controversy. By the early 2000s, ADX Florence had proven something unprecedented. It wasn't just a prison. It was a machine for human behavior, tested on the nation's most dangerous prisoners. And once the results were in, other states wanted in. The supermax model, extreme isolation, controlled environment, 23-hour lockdown, became a blueprint for high-security prisons across the country. Pelican Bay State Prison, California. Tams Correctional Center, Illinois. USP Florence High, Colorado. Each of these facilities borrowed heavily from ADX's architecture, its security systems, and even its psychological design. ADX wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a template, exported like a technology, a design for controlling minds, perfected in concrete and steel. But with replication came scrutiny. Human rights groups began to ask questions. What was the psychological cost of extreme isolation? Was ADX Florence humane? Or had architects and psychologists created a human experiment under the guise of justice? Reports began to surface. Quietly at first, detailing depression, hallucinations, self-harm, and suicide attempts among inmates. One report described ADX Florence as a prison designed to inflict mental suffering, not merely to confine. The Bureau of Prisons defended the model. They pointed to the lack of riots, escapes, and inmate-on-inmate violence. They called it safe, controlled, and effective. But critics argued that the true measure of a prison isn't control. It's whether it preserves human dignity. And in ADX, that argument was impossible to win. Even some of the people who helped design ADX began to question it. Architects who had drawn every line of concrete. Psychologists who had calculated every sensory deprivation technique. They started to ask themselves, have we gone too far? Did we build safety or weapon? And what happens when humans are broken at this scale? For a facility hailed as the most secure in America, the irony was chilling. Its creators couldn't control the moral consequences of their own design. By the mid-2000s, public attention began to mount. Families of inmates sued over conditions. Human rights organizations filed petitions to limit solitary confinement. International observers criticized the United States for violating basic human rights. And yet, ADX Florence continued to operate, largely insulated from the outside world. because the system was designed that way. Isolation didn't just apply to inmates. It applied to scrutiny, oversight, and accountability. ADX had become a paradox, a place engineered to control the uncontrollable. But in doing so, it became a symbol of something much larger. How far government might go to manage fear, and how architecture can be weaponized against the human mind. And the truth remains hidden. Who really designed ADX Florence? Who signed off on the psychological methods? And who in Washington decided that extreme isolation was the answer to America's prison crisis? The answers are scattered across classified documents, internal memos, and anonymous testimonies. But the effects are undeniable. The first inmates, Silverstein, Yusef, Kaczynski, had proven the system works. And now, generations of prisoners would face the same fate. Life inside the prison built for ghosts. ADX Florence is more than concrete and steel. It is a system of control that touches every moment of a prisoner's life. From the moment they step off the transport bus, inmates are stripped of almost everything familiar. Shoes, belts, personal items, gone. Uniforms are gray. Cells are gray. Even the walls, a sterile blank gray, enforce monotony. Every step is monitored, every sound recorded, every interaction choreographed to the second. The day begins at 7:30 a.m. Lights snap on. Breakfast arrives through a small steel slot. No talking, no gathering, no choice. Time is regimented. Exercise is limited to 1 hour per day in a small concrete yard, caged above by wire mesh. Even movement inside the cell is tracked. For the prisoners, life is predictable to the point of madness. Inmates call it the cage. Psychologists call it environmental conditioning. And the Bureau calls it maximum security. Every interaction with guards is formal and distanced. Doors open remotely. Food is delivered through slots. Mail is screened meticulously. Even the air vents are positioned to reduce noise and prevent communication. The effect is insidious. Prisoners report loss of sense of time, hallucinations, extreme anxiety, depression, and in some cases, a breakdown of identity itself. Psychologists have predicted some of these effects, but the human cost was staggering. Some prisoners spent decades in these cells. Men like Thomas Silverstein became almost entirely withdrawn. He rarely spoke, almost never left a cell, and only interacted through notes or supervised sessions. Ramzi Youssef, the terrorist mastermind, found his plotting reduced to fragments, disconnected from the outside world. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, meticulously maintained routines, but even he could not escape the monotony of time suspended in concrete. For the guards, life was paradoxical. They were shielded from danger. No prisoner could get close. No riot could erupt in the hallways. Yet, many describe the job as unnerving. You walk past cells with men who may be violent geniuses, and all you hear is silence. The silence itself becomes threatening. One former officer said, "You start to feel like the building itself is alive, watching us as much as we watch them." Years of isolation take a psychological toll not only on inmates, but on the staff tasked with controlling them. Some guards reported emotional numbness. Others struggled with nightmares or anxiety. The architects and psychologists had designed control, but the cost extended beyond the walls of the cells. And yet, in this controlled environment, some prisoners found ways to survive. Writing letters, journals, coded notes, exercise routines, creating structure within isolation. Mental puzzles, mathematics, memorization, meditation. These small acts of resistance became lifelines, a way to preserve a shred of identity in a system designed to erase it. ADX Florence is a prison unlike any other. It is concrete. It is steel. It is silence. But most of all, it is a place where the limits of human endurance are tested every single day. And for those who step inside, there is one lesson. Isolation is not just a punishment. It is a force, one that can strip a person of time, space, and sometimes themselves. Notorious inmates and the limits of isolation. ADX Florence was built for the worst of the worst. Men society deemed too dangerous for any other prison. But what happens when extreme isolation meets extreme minds? The results are both fascinating and terrifying. Take Thomas Silverstein, perhaps the most infamous inmate in ADX history. Convicted of multiple murders within the federal prison system, Silverstein arrived at ADX in 1983, before the prison formally opened, and was immediately placed in solitary confinement. The Bureau's behavioral model predicted he would eventually comply with the rules, but Silverstein resisted. For decades, he lived almost entirely in isolation, 23 hours a day, no interaction, only guards, only walls. And yet, he became a legend inside the system, the man who couldn't be broken, the man who challenged the very idea that isolation could control violence. Then there was Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He arrived at ADX under tight security, bringing with him the mind of a planner, a strategist, and a manipulator. Even here, with no access to other inmates and constant surveillance, Youssef tried to manipulate the system. Letters were intercepted. Visits were monitored. Everything he attempted to regain control was neutralized. ADX Florence had proven effective, even against a man trained to outthink the authorities. And then there was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Kaczynski had spent years in isolation before ADX, living off-grid, planning attacks in complete secrecy. But ADX's design stripped him of freedom of movement, interaction, and sensory variation. For a mind accustomed to independence, it was a psychological earthquake. Routine became obsession. Time became distorted. Even the simplest tasks, eating, reading, exercising, became a form of endurance. The prison was working exactly as intended. Yet each inmate adapted differently, revealing something the designers hadn't fully anticipated. Isolation is a tool, but the human mind is unpredictable. ADX Florence's first decades tested not just physical security, but psychological boundaries. Some inmates lost touch with reality. Some resisted through meticulous routines. Some wrote letters no one would ever read. Silverstein, Youssef, Kaczynski, 3 men, 3 responses to the same environment: total compliance, obsessive adaptation, mental deterioration. And the prison learned from each case. Every behavior was logged. Every reaction was studied. Every failure was analyzed. ADX Florence was more than a prison. It had become a psychological laboratory where the limits of human endurance were being silently measured. But as effective as ADX was, it raised uncomfortable questions. How much isolation is too much? What is the ethical cost of total control? And what does it say about society that designs prisons not just to contain, but to reshape minds? Even within the Bureau, debates raged. Some saw ADX as a triumph of engineering and psychology. Others called it cruel, inhumane, and dangerously untested. The stories of these inmates reveal the limits of isolation and the paradox at the heart of ADX Florence, a prison designed to control the uncontrollable. But in doing so, it also tests the boundaries of morality, law, and humanity itself. ADX Florence is more than a prison. It is concrete, steel, and silence. It is a place where human behavior has been tested, measured, and manipulated. From the architects who drew its lines, to the psychologists who designed its isolation, to the infamous inmates who endured its relentless control, ADX tells a story about the limits of human endurance, the power of design, and the moral questions that arise when control becomes absolute. But the story of ADX Florence is far from over. Every year, new inmates arrive, new methods are tested, and the debate continues. How far is too far when it comes to security? And what is the human cost of a prison built to erase individuality? If you found this story gripping, unsettling, and impossible to look away from, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves real-life mysteries, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the darkest corners of crime and incarceration. Because the walls of ADX Florence may be silent, but the story behind them speaks volumes.